Hi, everyone. The end of class was a little hectic today, so I actually just want to take a minute or two to talk about oral histories and to point you to some of the resources that I've set up that hopefully will help you with the assignment that's due on Wednesday. So I'm just going to talk briefly about what an oral history is, why I think they're useful, and what I'm asking you to do for Wednesday. One thing I'll say at the beginning is that oral histories are something that we're going to be dealing with and grappling with in various forms over pretty much the rest of the semester. So if you aren't exactly sure what one is now or why we're using them, hopefully that will become more clear over the semester. But I also want you to be thinking critically, how do we use this information? That oral histories are things that I think are both useful in terms of the firsthand account they give of generally a historical situation, but they also have their limits because of the same thing, because they are firsthand accounts of something, and firsthand accounts are tricky in terms of using them to make claims about history or about society or about how something works more generally than beyond an individual's experience. The term oral history itself is both historical and contemporary. Historically, oral histories have been with us, and I'm going to make a kind of claim I tell people not to, but they have been with us throughout time, it seems, or at least in terms of recorded human history in various forms. People have used oral histories to communicate information, often generationally. So before there was writing, before there were published books or printed books, people would transmit information orally. They would pass it down through song. You might think of Homer, the Odyssey, many indigenous cultures communicate information through the spoken word. And that, is one type of oral history. Today, the term tends to be used for in a little more of a precise way in terms of how information that has been collected through oral means is recorded and preserved. So there's a lot of oral history projects that collect stories from, say, Holocaust survivors or from 9/11 survivors or first responders. And those oral histories are often recorded and then preserved in some kind of archive, like we saw with the Woody Guthrie Center. We'll see at OSU Tulsa, they have some oral histories. So there's some preservation involved. And on the assignment sheet, which should have been 2 pages, and I think most people only got 1 page, and that was my error because I was a little flustered. So that's why I want to take a moment to remind you of some things here. That on the oral history assignment sheet on the first page, I give a few definitions there in the middle of the page, where I note that it's both a field of study and a method of gathering, preserving, and interpreting the voices and memories of people, communities, and participants in past events. Oral history is both the oldest type of historical inquiry, as I mentioned, predating the written word, and one of the most modern, initiated with tape recorders in the 1940s, and I think maybe even earlier, and now using 21st century digital technologies. So oral history collection, there tends to be a bit of a training process. And I've gone through this process in some form, that you kind of think about what are the questions that are most conducive to encouraging people to tell their story, generally of a specific historical situation, like I said. So Holocaust survivors, 9/11 survivors, former slaves, people who experienced the Dust Bowl, women workers in factories in the 1940s. I mean, there tends to be a kind of meaning or group reason for why these are being collected and preserved together. Not always, but there tends to be some uniting theme. For Wednesday, this is generally, I'm wanting to have a kind of introduction to oral history. So for Wednesday, I'd like you to find an oral history that's available online. I'd like you to listen to an oral history or read the transcript, or do both, and I'll talk about that in a moment, and then write a short 2-page paper that's a summary and an analysis of that oral history. So the goals with this are, 1, to find oral histories, to think about how you would summarize that amount of information for an audience to give them the general story that's being communicated, and then to analyze both the usefulness and the challenges of using that specific oral history were you to pursue research in that area. So, as I say at the beginning of the assignment sheet, your introduction needs to identify your text, who is being interviewed, who does the interview, when does it happen, where is it done, what is the context, and then lay out your own personal reasons for choosing this interview. Now, you might not be able to answer all of those questions. Sometimes that information is detailed with the oral history, and sometimes it isn't. So answer what you can. That too should cause you to think about, how do you start to think critically about documents if you don't know who the interview is, if you don't know what the context is, if you don't know why it's being interviewed. How much do you need to know that in order to use the information? The body paragraphs, how you organize those is up to you. We're going to be moving into more and more of your own initiated structure. So in other words, increasingly you'll get to decide how your papers are organized here. This is a halfway point, but your body paragraph should summarize and then analyze the documents based on some of the included questions. So I gave you pretty much another full sheet of included questions. If you don't have those, it means you probably did not pick up that second sheet. There are possible questions you could ask. You don't need to ask them all. So that is up to you, how many of those you use, but they are a guide to get you thinking. So in other words, the body paragraphs have at least one that summarizes the content, and then at least one or two that analyze the content. So be doing both in your body paragraphs. In your conclusion, you should talk about, what does this item teach you? What questions does it raise? What are 2 other or 3 possible directions for research if you were to research this specific time period, or something about something that stands out to you about this time period? So in other words, it could be about the history of American slavery, or you could think more generally about perseverance, or about survival, or about the organization of labor in this country. So you can go in a few different directions. That is due on Wednesday. You need to bring 1 copy of that to class. We'll talk a bit about it before we get into the library session, but also keep in mind that, again, we'll keep coming back to oral histories and other firsthand accounts and primary documents, and think about what role we can or should have in terms of primary documents. I'm going to post this video. I'm also going to include a link to Oklahoma State's oral history research project that lists a number of oral history projects, and you can go into their databases to find examples of oral history. On the back of the first page of the assignment sheet, I've given a number of links to other oral histories that you can use. I will say that with oral histories, sometimes there will be the audio, sometimes there'll be a transcription, which is a typed version of the audio, and sometimes there'll be both. I do think it's useful to find ones that have audio, and I was going to go through this in class, and we'll spend some time looking at this next week, but one of the places I'll link you to is one that has both audio and transcripts. Sometimes, like I said, it'll be one or the other. If you choose an oral history that is shorter than 10 to 12 minutes, you'll need to do 2. So you need to have at least 20 minutes of something that you've listened to for Wednesday. So again, if you choose a shorter one, then you're going to need to choose 2. And a lot of the 9/11 ones are super useful. They're well recorded, they're well preserved, but they tend to be shorter. So, and they're more highly edited, and that is what makes them shorter as well. So you would need to do 2 of those. But I'll give some links, try to walk you through it, and some links that hopefully will appear below this video. I think that's all for now. If you do have questions, of course, email and be in touch. But keep in mind, this isn't part of your large research project. This is just getting us thinking about primary sources, about how you access them, about where they're preserved, about how you think critically about them, and about finding ones that you're interested in, and to see that there are all of these oral histories out there. One final note, that you can also just Google oral history if you wanted to say find oral history, and someone did one on like Art Deco or kind of pop culture artists, and there can be oral histories about that. But one warning about the term oral history, it gets thrown around kind of casually now, and sometimes is used for like any interview. We're really looking for something that's been preserved as part of a collection, that's in an archive in some form. So this isn't just any interview, and this isn't just anyone talking about their lives. There needs to be some archival aspect to it in terms of historical preservation. So again, I've given you a number of links. I'm going to link some more beneath here. We're going to talk about this on Wednesday when we meet in the library, and we'll continue to come back to ideas of oral history and primary documents throughout the rest of the semester. I hope everyone is well. If you have any questions or concerns about the things that are due on Wednesday or about anything that happened in class, please don't hesitate to be in touch. Thank you all for being calm and supportive of everyone, and I will see you all on Wednesday.